I've been asked to share with you an important aspect of the esoteric magical tradition, which many people aren't familiar with. So I'm going to address it and do my best to explain it. Um, I'm aware it may end up having to be 2 or even 3 of these short talks, simply because it has very wide ramifications. So it starts off really with the aspects of consciousness, or you could say the roles of consciousness, or how consciousness functions. Now, of course, the old mystery schools were more aware of consciousness and its attributes and its possibilities than until the last century here in Europe. Up until then, it wasn't understood until the work of people like Freud and Jung came into place. But basically, nowadays we would talk about the subconscious mind, which is the greater aspect of the mind, which is beneath the level of waking consciousness. It's the vast reservoir, and the magical tradition uses that to an extraordinary degree, even not suspected even nowadays by psychologists and others. The self-conscious, of course, is pretty obvious. It's the waking consciousness, when we see and identify things and our day-to-day living, what we concentrate on momentarily, and what we label. We name it. Oh, there's a chair. There's a picture on the wall. Oh, look, there's David, etc. What the naming thing. And then there's the aspect of consciousness which modern psychology doesn't really take into account, what some people, to use modern terms, would call super consciousness or enlightened consciousness. Now, to begin with, I want to show you how these have been pictured in the tarot deck down through the centuries. So it's usually shown by these 3 things. The most famous, most obvious one is I'll take the Lover's card. If you can see it, you'll see there's the angel at the top. Then on one side there's the female, on the second side there's the male. Now, in the Hermetic and alchemical traditions, waking consciousness is signified by the male figure, the subconscious by the female figure, and in this case, the angelic is super consciousness, enlightened consciousness. So let's first talk about this definition of using a male figure for self-consciousness and a female figure for subconsciousness. It's nothing really to do with gender. It's simply to do with, in those days, how things operated. By which I mean, in those days it was mainly men who went out and hunted, who went out and did things. They were active in that particular sense, and even in the last century, until very recent times, it was mainly considered men who went out and did the cut and thrust of business and engaged with whatever their work was. They were the doers. And that's why it's used to represent self-consciousness, because self-consciousness is active. It has a very small scope. It's only to do with what's really happening at that particular time. And it sees things and it labels things and it makes deductions and it makes decisions and thus activities based purely upon that. The female figures were used to represent the subconsciousness. I mean, bear in mind we're dealing with stereotypes here, but that's what happens with archetypes. You have to use some stereotypic figure. And so there the conception is that in those days the woman was at home. She was doing repetitive jobs over and over and over again. Cleaning the house, making the food, changing the babies, and everything that goes with that. And so this was the figure used for subconsciousness. Actually, it's quite brilliant because it's a fact that if you find yourself worrying about something but you can't work out what it is, why am I feeling so depressed? Why am I, etc. Just try, painting a wall with a neutral colour. And surely after a couple of hours, you will have realised what it is that is bothering you. Repetitive work leads to getting in touch with the subconscious mind. And so it will surface what is of concern. This is, of course, what led to the idea, which was very apparent in when I started training in these things, led to the idea that women were more psychic than men. That used to be the view. We now know that isn't actually the case. It was simply down to what I've just covered, is that most women had monotonous lives or repetitive lives. I know people like to get sentimental about the kids, but let's say repetitive. Even if you love your kids, there's a time when you think, oh, please God, let me have a interesting conversation with somebody. Repetitive jobs done over and over again enable a person to be in touch with their inner self. And so this is the intuitive self. This is the self that perceives things and picks things up. And so it leads to a sensitivity, to a psychic thing. Men, in the stereotype that were out there in the cut and thrust, having to see what's going on, making the deal, looking at the shares, or chasing the buffalo, or whatever. They have to stay really present in the physical plane of what's happening around them. So this is where the view came from of that women were more psychic and men were more intuitive, well, not intuitive, were more focused on the earth plane. But of course, in the past 30 years, that has changed. Nowadays, we have what some people call home fathers. In other words, men who live at home, sometimes working at home, or sometimes the wife, the female partner, is the actual worker. And so she's out there and the man has a better disposition towards the home and the cooking and the kids. And so we notice that in that particular thing, this male will become more intuitive, whereas the woman, the businesswoman who's out there in the cut and thrust, is often not very psychic at all by the end. In other words, it's about function. It's about those aspects of mind that get used. But I had to cover that ground so you understand where this imagery comes from. Because it's very important you don't accept the imagery literally. And later on, when we come to discuss magic and ritual work, this becomes even more important. So I'm using tarot as the example because that's where it's seen the most clearly. And probably the most obvious card in which it is the one, the so-called lovers. And here is Mother Eve, as I showed you before, representing subconscious. The male, Adam, is self-consciousness, and then above them is super-consciousness, which is the fusion of the two. But this threefold division continues elsewhere, not always with human beings, but for example, here it is in what's regarded as the perfected state. This is in the card Judgment, number 20. Again, you have the male and female on either side, and the superconsciousness is represented again by an angelic figure, in this case Gabriel. It was Raphael in the previous card. But there's this extra aspect of consciousness in the middle, done like a child, meaning new. And that's referring to a newly dawned state of superconsciousnness, which of course is what the Judgment card represents in essence. But you find it also, here's a symbolism, a rather grim symbolism, but it's meant to be grim. Here's the Devil card. I'm afraid it's rather dark, but that's the nature of the colouring. So there's the adversary, the devil figure, subconscious, with the inverted star on his forehead. It's inverted, so it ends up with 2 points upwards. So this means dualism. So this represents a mind that is enslaved to dualism. And that's why the same figures representing subconscious and superconsciousness are chained to the pedestal of the father of lies. And also they have slightly demonic qualities signified by the little horns and the hooves. So you could be said this is how many people are, enslaved to appearance, enslaved to patterns. And so this is why in this form, this is where you get the idea of the old name for the devil being the father of lies. This is illusion. This is Maya. And this is why this card is used to signify it. And of course, the one I showed you before, the Judgment card, is the Liberation card. But there are other aspects in which it sometimes shows. Here's another form, but this is not using humans so much. This is the Chariot card. And here, the higher self is represented by the charioteer. And again, the subconscious and the self-consciousness here are the pairs of opposites. They are the sphinxes who would draw the chariot, though in this card it's currently at rest. And then this is the most useful for our purposes, because this is the card of the Hierophant. Now here the pairs of opposites are represented by the 2 kneeling figures before the Hierophant. They've got your back to you. Now here they're not shown, not using gender. This is another form of symbolism that gets used a lot. Here, if you can see closely, their vestments are embroidered with 2 different flowers. One has a red rose on their flowers, and the other one has white lilies. You see this quite a lot in tarot symbolism, but also in Masonic symbolism and in alchemical symbolism. The red rose represents the physical incarnate level, the powers of desire, the powers of the passions, that can be used skillfully once you know how, whereas the lilies represent the abstract and the astral faculties. Actually, to be very blunt, in an alchemical thing, the red rose is used to represent the physical body, while the white lily is used to represent the astral body. Why? Well, apart from the colours, it's also the original roses, of course, have 5 petals. So that signifies the 5 senses and the microcosm, whereas in the lilies are 6-petaled, which means the macrocosm, which means the higher levels, the astral, the spiritual, etc. So anyway, these are the aspects of the same person. Listening now turns inwards, turn towards the Hierophant, meaning this is the superconsciousness as the true teacher, as the golden teacher within. So this is just a touch of it at the moment. I hope in the next 1 or 2 to also show you how this applies to ritual and to your own liberation and to your own freedom.